Hi, everyone. Welcome to this special edition of Wright on the Nail, and I'm Chris Wright. It's great to be back after a 3-month break. I don't know where the 3 months has gone, but a lot's been happening in the world in the meantime. But we're going to try and be back with an episode every month, and boy, there is a lot to discuss. So today we have an amazing stellar panel with whom I will be discussing all the updates on what's been happening in the Middle East, Iran, Israel, Gaza, and of course the ongoing Ukraine situation, plus what's happening with the US and their foreign policy attacking Iran. And we're going to talk about Trump and his beautiful bill. And we're going to talk about how far down the road to authoritarianism he is taking the country. And then we're going to also focus on the UK. And there's a lot to talk about there as well. So we need some very important people to discuss these important issues. And we are joined by the founder and director of the Israeli Disarmament Movement and the Middle East Treaty Organization, Sharon Dolev. Sharon was also the Israeli representative on the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize laureate international campaign for abolishing nuclear weapons. Also, we're joined by the China correspondent and formerly Middle East correspondent at the Times, Richard Spencer. Since October 7, Richard has stayed reporting on the Middle East as well as China, most recently focusing on the US-Israel conflict with Iran. And we're also joined by two regular contributors, Jean Monnet, Professor of European Integration at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth, John O'Brennan, and also writer, broadcaster, columnist, and wonderful to have on the show once again, Christina Patterson. And we're delighted also to be joined by Emad Kieh. Emad is director at the Middle East Treaty Organization and co-author of Weapons of Mass Destruction, A New Approach to Non-Proliferation. So welcome, Emad. So where do we start? Let's just start with addressing what has been happening in the Middle East. And let's talk about Trump's bizarre attacks on the Iranian nuclear sites. Why did it happen? What did it achieve? And we have conflicting reports as to whether it actually obliterated all Iran's nuclear capacity or whether they managed to get all of the nuclear products stored away somewhere else before the sites were attacked. Now, Richard, what do you think is the real truth behind this?
In reverse order, I mean, I don't think they've got all the nuclear stuff in general terms, but they've got quite a lot of it. So, if you want to look at purely from a, analysis of the military success of the Israeli and American operations, you'd say it was like pretty successful, but not totally successful. Not totally successful, partly for kind of the weird way that this unfolded in this, the way that America was brought in later, when you would argue that, America with the most force at its disposal, should have been leading the operation, but it didn't. So we assume, for example, that the Iranians managed to squirrel away their existing stockpile of highly enriched uranium, which is enough to make, if they did decide to build an atom bomb, there's enough there for quite a few bombs if it was enriched further, which isn't very difficult. Or you could make a sort of big old-fashioned type of bomb, with what you've got. You don't need such high enrichment for an old-fashioned type of sort of Hiroshima type of bomb. If you I mean, that's slightly incorrect, but sort of in general terms. So, and they've also, of course, still got some of their facilities that are involved in this project, and they've got some of their personnel, though they've lost a lot of their military and scientific personnel to Israeli assassination. So, there's a gradual coalescing of opinion between the various people monitoring this. I mean, there were wildly differing views at first, with Trump saying it had been completely obliterated, fully and completely, and other people saying, well, maybe, not very much. It can be rebuilt within 2 years, according to the Pentagon, or within 5 or 6 months, I guess, according to the other end of the spectrum of people analysing this. So it's been set back, but not totally obliterated, as Trump said. Why it happened? Well, it's that's a bigger question of the way Israel and America work together in terms of their broader policies in the Middle East, sometimes following the same track, sometimes following slightly parallel tracks. Maybe that's something we would want to go into later.
Yeah, I mean, how much would Israel and America be working together on everything? And to what extent does Israel do things without America knowing up front that it's going to happen?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously they work very closely. There's really close ties between the military and between the political apparatus more generally. When I say that, I mean, although you may not have daily meetings at a formal level, say between Netanyahu's team and Trump's team, there are such close links between individual Israeli politicians and individual American politicians that there are always channels open, even if the governments don't always see eye to eye. And obviously, with democratic governments in the States in the last couple of decades, there has been less seeing eye to eye, particularly with Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister. With Trump, what happened here, I think, was quite interesting because Trump interesting for America and for a while, and for all of us, of course, because as Trump sends out these continually conflicting messages. On the one hand, you're American first, we're going to be the great military power, no one can say no to us, we won't be restrained by anybody else. On the other hand, this isolationist wing of Trumpism saying, no, just focus on internal issues in America. We've got our own problems. Let's not get involved in the Middle East. Let's not do other countries' bidding. A sort of slightly weird, often quite anti-Semitic wing of the Trumpism umbrella, if you like, the sort of Tucker Carlson wing, directly hostile to Israel, directly using sort of common anti-Semitic tropes to characterize Israel's influence on American politics. And Trump also listened to that. So he comes out with these things saying, I'm not going to listen to Netanyahu anymore. Now, I've always thought that was a very minority element of Trump's thought, but it was clear that he didn't say, right, I'm going to lead this bombing raid on Iran's nuclear stuff. It's clear that was a decision taken by Netanyahu with an assessment that Trump would follow if Netanyahu led, and that's exactly what happened. Now, I think that Trump was always inclined, sooner or later, to say yes. But he was sort of jumped into it, and he did say yes, which doesn't make him look particularly strong. But on the other hand, it also does get the standard Republican base, which is very pro-Israel, obviously, around him, and sort of sets out the lines of his presidency quite clearly, actually, which he's in foreign policy. He's going to be a quite conventional right-wing Republican president, which I think was always the case, but there was some doubt about that.
What about regime change? And let's open this up to everybody. I mean, we've had a pretty checkered history of trying to inflict regime change on different countries that we have intervened in, and regime change was certainly one of the aspects of this. Is there any chance of regime change in Iran? And if there was, what would it look like? Or would it just plunge it into the same kind of ridiculous situation that Iraq was put into, and Libya as well?
From my perspective, I think regime change is one of those expressions that's become, it's taken on a life of its own, if you like. Regime change aren't all the same. I don't think there's any chance that America is going to do what it did in 2003 in Iraq, which is the comparison there was making, partly because of the WMD thing. I mean, there are parallels, there are echoes, but Trump's been pretty clear he's not going to put more boots on the ground in the Middle East, and he's not going to try and seek regime change with American troops. He'd be mad to do so, and there is simply no will for that in America. Can there be, an uprising that overthrows the Islamic regime and, replaces it with something else? Again, I don't see how that's likely to happen. The regime has shown it's prepared to use extreme force to put down protests. It's done that several times in the last 20 years. Regimes, whether it's China in 1989 or, other Middle Eastern regimes like Egypt at the moment, for example, that are prepared to kill protesters on the streets to preserve their regimes, often stay in power. There is, the other possibility, which is slightly underwritten, I think, which is a different kind of regime change, if you like. Where, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who's the supreme leader, he's 86. He's not going to go on forever. We don't know what his plans for succession are. He's apparently sent an envelope with 3 possible names in it to the Revolutionary Guard. I always use a slightly nerdy comparison, perhaps, is my other hat, of what happened in China in the 70s. When Chairman Mao died, there wasn't regime change. The Communist Party is still in power, but there was a sort of mini coup in that his coterie of supporters, the Gang of Four, were swiftly removed and jailed, and then his designated successor was gradually eased out over the next couple of years, replaced by Deng Xiaoping, and you had a very different China. It wasn't a regime change in the formal sense, but it was a very different China, still authoritarian, obviously. And I can think you might be able to see that here, and that might be a sort of indirect result of the bombing, in that, Iran's weakness under the Islamic regime has been really, made clear, including to its own people. So that might impel the people who decide what happens after Khamenei dies to say, well, we'll go in a somewhat different direction. The problem is, of course, it might be an even more authoritarian direction. It might be doubling down on military rule. For example, the Revolutionary Guard might end up as the single most powerful force rather than the clerics. But that's hard to say.
So Sharon, bringing you in, how far has Israel got in general in achieving its objectives? And is it actually going to ever get to the point where it says, right, job done?
It's a very good question, and it taps into the question of the regime change in Iran. So the question is, of course, when you say objectives, whose objectives? If the objectives is Netanyahu's, he kind of achieved his objective, meaning he can portray it inside the Israeli media, maybe in the US, maybe it's the 2 only places where it actually works, to say that he won on something since October 7th, right? There's a winning. But it's funny to think that this was about the nuclear weapons, this attack. And it shows a very, very closed discourse that doesn't take into account things that we know since at least 2012. One is that the Iranian nuclear program is scattered. In a way, because Israel already attacked 2 other facilities, the Iranians learned from that. This is one thing. The second thing is, it's one thing that is not taken into account as much is that Iran and the US were actually in negotiation when the attack took place. So what was the real objective? If you attack in the middle of negotiations, your objective is not to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. That you can achieve only in negotiations. So it's also not about a regime change. After all, Netanyahu knows that one of the reasons that he's keeping the horrible war on Gaza, not returning the hostages, is because he's trying to get to continue his regime, and that he's so afraid of a regime change that he's putting us in a forever war. And at the same time, he's attacking another state, saying that this will help a regime change. That usually is not the case. Usually, when you're being attacked, you rally around the flag. So what is the objectives? The objectives that were announced were not achieved. If Iran wants to build a nuclear bomb, Iran can still build a nuclear bomb. If Iran could have built a nuclear bomb since almost 2003, if not before, and didn't do that up till now, maybe the reasonable thing to understand from that is that Iran is on the threshold of becoming a nuclear arms state, and that's exactly where Iran wants to be. Everything that was done in this attack was in order to push Iran to make a decision that most people don't want Iran to make. It's only good for Netanyahu.
Okay, so I mean, John, where do you see this all ending then, from your perspective, and how does Gaza come into play in the overall scope of things?
Well, I published a piece this morning with one of my Iranian PhD students, and in it we argued that the most significant casualty from all of this will be the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. It's been one of the biggest successes of the post-1945 international security order. It has meant that nuclear weapons haven't proliferated beyond a small range of states. But if you're sitting anywhere in the Middle East right now, what conclusions do you draw? Well, first, that Israel is by far the strongest military power in the region. It's chaotic and unpredictable, and that's backed up by an equally chaotic and volatile Trump regime in Washington. If you're Turkey or Saudi Arabia, I think the lesson that you've learned is that the only way you can be sure of protecting yourself in the future is by getting hold of nuclear weapons. The Iranian regime has learned the hard way that the failure to actually complete the project of acquiring a nuclear weapon left them uniquely vulnerable. And it's not just in this instance you can see it. Remember during Trump's previous presidency, when the Americans assassinated Soleimani, the head of the Republican Guard, probably the second most important political figure in Iran after Ayatollah Khamenei, the Iranians basically didn't respond. Last year, when they, for the first time, sent missiles against Israel, almost all of those missiles were taken down by the Iron Dome defense system. Now, in this latest iteration of conflict, that wasn't the case, and about 7 or 8% of Iranian missiles got through and killed people in Israeli towns and cities. But for sure, I think the effect of this is a Wild West kind of acceleration in the desire to acquire nuclear weapons. And I think any rational actor in this region could only conclude that the only way you can possibly be safe, even if, as in the case of Saudi Arabia, currently you have got a relatively peaceful relationship with Israel, you can't be sure about the future and what it will bring. And if the NPT itself, along with the entire kind of architecture of international institutions, is collapsing, well, the only lesson you draw from that is we have to acquire nuclear weapons. And I'm sure it's the lesson that the Iranian regime has learned from this.
So, I mean, really, if Saudi Arabia wanted a nuclear weapon, they've got the financial wherewithal. They've probably got the expertise. They could have one. Why shouldn't they have one? What is the? I mean, of course, we don't want loads of people to have nuclear weapons. But what is the reason why we should say that Saudi Arabia can't have a nuclear weapon?
I can only assume that in the past, their security relationship with the United States has been so close that the Americans persuaded them that this would not be the right path to pursue for a variety of different reasons. And I think they had enough confidence in the American security backing of Saudi Arabia that they just weren't tempted to do that. Now, however, I think all bets are off, in part because of the unreliability of the Trump administration. And we heard it there in what Sharon attested to. One day he's in negotiations with the Iranians and boasting about how well they're going. The next day they're dropping bunker-busting bombs on Iran's nuclear facilities. This is a completely unreliable ally as well as adversary. And I think there will be lessons drawn from that, as I say, throughout the region, and it includes Saudi as it does other countries.
Yeah. So, I mean, Christina, we had Glastonbury last weekend and we had some issues there. And I just wondered, I mean, is it possible to be concerned about what's happening in the Middle East and concerned about what's going on in Gaza and to express those views without being accused of being anti-Semitic?
Well, it seems to be very difficult at the moment. And I've lost 2 friendships over this war, which obviously is nothing, absolutely nothing compared to what people in Gaza have lost and people in Israel who've lost relatives on the 7th of October and since. But I think we have, and sadly, largely because of Trump, established a climate in this country where it's very hard to speak out. I'm always, I have to say, reluctant to speak out on this because I'm not an expert. Obviously, I follow things very closely. I've been to Iran and care passionately about the country. I haven't been to Israel. And when, after the 7th of October on Sky News, when I was asked to speak about all of this, I did so very reluctantly, generally ended up with a migraine afterwards, and spoke very carefully, which I continue to do. I think what has been so tragic about the situation is that clearly Hamas started this particular war in a very, very brutal way. And it was right that countries around the world spoke out in support of Israel. But of course, what has happened since has been, at some point, and it's hard to define the point. I mean, obviously, the minute you're blowing children apart, that is a point, but that does happen in wars. And if you treat your population as human shields and hide underground with your designer handbags, then obviously it's very hard to know how you combat an enemy who behaves that way. But what has happened since has been an abomination. And we're now hearing about the instructions that the IDF have been explicitly given, and also workers at the puppet aid agency that has been installed to be shot at and in many cases killed by the IDF. That is, I mean, clearly a war crime, also an absolute moral turpitude that is unimaginable, that people who have lost everything and have lost their homes and many members of their family and are literally hungry, are trying to get food for their family to eat, and they are murdered trying to do that. I mean, that is a line I can't remember hearing of in my lifetime, or not in a so-called liberal democracy. I think you can argue about whether Israel is anymore a liberal democracy, as indeed we can get onto with Trump. But the net result of that, and the fact that, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for Keir Starmer. I think he's doing an impossible job, and I'm sure we'll get onto that later. And I understand why everybody felt, many people felt they needed to speak in support of Israel at the beginning. But the fact that nobody in government, or very cautiously, is speaking out against this abomination, I understand why people at Glastonbury are saying things about the IDF. Of course they crossed a line. It was a legal line you should not cross. I don't know whether they realized at the time, some people aren't actually aware of the laws against incitement of hatred and violence. Clearly they were idiotic on that front, and they will pay for it in their career terms. But the fact that throughout the week, the headline has been the BBC's bad behavior when Israel is shooting civilians seeking food is, to me, unimaginable. And I think we have to find a way of talking about all this stuff that doesn't mean being on one side or the other. I am not on one side or the other. I am on the side of international law in this. And international law was broken on the 7th of October, and it has been broken by Israel many times since.
Well, Christina, that's very well said. Very, very, very perceptive overview. But Imad, bringing you in, I mean, what is your perception as to how the rest of the world are viewing what's going on? Do people in Israel feel that, look, the whole world's on our side here, or do they think, some of the things that are going on here aren't playing too well in some of the other cities around the world?
Thank you, Chris. I mean, the latest confrontation between Israel and Iran brings into, it's been highlighted already by other speakers, but I think what it has done is that, first and foremost, it hasn't brought more security to Israel or its people. It has opened another front that could cause major disturbances. The fact that some of these missiles from Iran's retaliation got through, and the fact that we have millions of Israelis being forced to go into shelters and so forth, has also broken a psychological barrier that gave them the invisibility in terms of the protection that they will have. That being said, I think the biggest casualty of this latest confrontation is the broken trust, the fact that there was negotiations going on, and suddenly there's a bombardment that is happening 2 days before we even have the final round possibly of Iran-US negotiations. So first, trust is a major casualty of this war. The reliance on any other power, United States credibility has been broken on international fronts. When it comes to international law, Christina, John, you both mentioned it. It's completely now a wild, wild west. From the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to the semblance of the Geneva Protocol or any other convention that has been put into place to avert, to change, and to stop any of these sort of transgressions that we have seen. That being said, where we see it now, actually, where I was in Doha when the Iranian missiles hit the military base, US base, in retaliation for US bombing of Iranian nuclear facilities. And there was something really bizarre happening. While this was happening, the people that I was around with somehow felt like, we see this as a natural response by Iran, but at the moment they are seeing the bully being Israeli government and Israel and United States. And the people of the streets, from what we've seen even in the music festivals and just the pulse of the people across the world, see this as an aggressive approach by the means of war and destruction to, at the end, for what? And so if I would be sitting in Israel, do I feel that I have the support of the world? Not really. Do I feel like I'm being betrayed by my own government by opening up another level of insecurity for me, but at the same time also making it extremely difficult, as we have seen the popular sentiment on the streets in the real world sees the Israeli government as an aggressor. And I think that this has changed a lot of the narratives, a lot of the perceptions that makes it extremely difficult for Israeli government and its people to feel secure and to feel being seen as on the side of trying to protect their people. That being said, Chris, I think what is also very important here is that 2 nuclear weapon states have attacked a non-nuclear weapon state. This by itself is a huge red line that has been crossed. Targeting civilian nuclear facilities with weapons and assassinations of scientists again crosses many, many lines on international law. We have a country like Iran who has the reason why we know that Iran enriches to the levels that it has, the stockpile that it has, the facilities that it has, is because it's part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, because it is the most surveyed nuclear program under International Atomic Energy Agency. And these were in place so that Iran does not divert towards a nuclear weapon. And as your other speakers have mentioned, where we are sitting now, we've never been closer within Iran in the discussions about what is the purpose and the benefit of remaining within these conventions and international norms if you get bombed by just like the credibility is already broken. And I think that ultimately what we can draw from this latest confrontation and post-October 7th is that there is obviously domestic reasons for Netanyahu to continue the war, and Sharon has mentioned on that. But on a bigger picture is also the fact that you cannot guarantee your security on the basis of insecurity for others. And you cannot secure your security through the use of violence. So ultimately, we are left with the other option, which is diplomacy. And that, thanks to this latest war, has been crumbled in terms of its ability to continue.
Yeah. Well, to come on to diplomacy, when Trump was elected, he said he would stop the Ukraine war in 24 hours and he would not go into any foreign wars. And it seems like we're now 6 months into the Trump presidency, and that 24 hours was a long time ago. we don't talk about Ukraine anymore, but Ukraine's still ongoing. There's no end to it, and the proliferation of what's happening in the Middle East as well. The world is clearly a more dangerous place. And what are Trump's priorities, and how does he feel he can stop or does he think what's going to happen, and we'll just go along with it?
I mean, it's anyone's guess to think what Trump is thinking, because he changes his mind every so often. And I think that when we just saw about the NATO meeting that then bumped up the expenditure for defense to 5% for NATO members, it shows again that we are living in an era of might is right. And that in itself has caused us to arm more, militarize more, and give away. I mean, like, just look at the funding that is now, the shortages that United Nations is facing in terms of throughout its whole system. We are now removing and consciously destructing all of these structures that we built in post-Second World War to find better ways to resolve conflict. Because, Chris, we have conflicts, and that's normal between us, within us, amongst us. But the tool sets that we have to resolve conflicts are huge, are a multitude. One of them is through violence, but we have mediation, negotiations, discussions, and those have now been put to the side. And I think no matter Trump, we can, center on, but I think a much larger issue here is that we have other emerging and global powers that are also seeing what's happening in Washington and sort of like doubling down on, like, what? There's no point to discuss, to negotiate. And maybe we should actually arm and be prepared for a long war ahead.
Well, when you go to Washington for a meeting with Trump, in the old days, meetings would take place in meeting rooms, and then you'd have a press conference and you'd announce what you'd agreed. But now a meeting in Washington is a reality television set with an invited audience, and you sit there and it's broadcast live. How can any progress be made when really you're having conversations of the most important nature in the form of a reality television show? John, how can that happen?
Well, it is happening. It is the reality. Just look at what happened in the ambush of Zelensky back in February. And Trump and his people did the same thing to Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, also in the Oval Office a few weeks later. Now, I'd have thought Ramaphosa should have learned from what happened to Zelensky. He didn't. And he really should have stood up and walked out of that office on behalf of the South African people, rather than taking these lies and insults that were thrown at him, including about this supposed genocide of white farmers in South Africa. I think there's an awareness everywhere that Trump 2.0 is a much more radical beast than the first iteration between 2017 and 2021. We're seeing that play out in foreign policy as we are domestically, because the turn to authoritarianism in the US itself has happened at a much faster speed than most commentators predicted. And the chaos and the volatility is just one part of this that foreign leaders, I think, have got to work with and work through. But we have seen on any number of occasions, including, for example, when Mark Carney was running for election and immediately afterwards when he met Trump, if you stand up to him, he folds. And that's in both the performative sense that he will give way and the practical sense in negotiations. The world's worst negotiator, I had to stop myself swearing there because it's almost automatic, almost always ends up doing bad deals for his own country. And we're speaking at a point where they have just passed one of the worst pieces of legislation ever to pass through both houses in Washington, it's going to cost the American people dearly, including many of Trump's own supporters. But the bigger issue may well be the increased debt that it imposes on future generations of Americans. It's completely scandalous, and it's only one part of this psychodrama that is playing out before our eyes.
So is America still a democracy?
No, not in any meaningful sense. And I was thinking about this yesterday as the bill was going through the House of Representatives, and you had all these Republicans who were committed to fiscal discipline up until last night and who were opposed to the bill up until last night. They will all, or many of them, will face re-election in November 2026. But the big question now becomes whether the United States is even capable of holding a pluralist democratic election. And I'm very doubtful about that, Chris, because the speed at which Trump and his acolytes have captured institutions has been astonishing, arguably faster than Hitler managed in 1933. Remember, it's only in June 34 when he eliminates huge numbers of people from the SA and other parties that his power is absolutely consolidated. We're only 6 months into Trump's presidency, and many of the same features that are classically identified with authoritarian regimes, they're all there.
Yeah, I mean, it's frightening how quickly it's changed. I mean, I wonder how much we feel that America could hold a normal democratic election in 3.5 years' time, but also even in 18 months' time when we're coming up to the midterms. I mean, what's our view as to what's going to happen in the midterm elections, and will that have any major impacts on how this change in America could be halted?
I think, I agree with John. I think this is the worst bill that, certainly in my lifetime, that I can remember being passed by any democracy. I think one of the awful things about it is the pure cynicism, the fact that they have delayed the Medicaid element until after the midterms. So people who don't follow this stuff closely may not really have much idea what's about to hit them. And I think the prediction is that by 2034, up to 12 million Americans will be uninsured. They will have no medical insurance at all, whether that be Medicaid, Medicare, or so-called Obamacare, which is unimaginable in, the country that is meant to be the leader of the free world. And I mean, I've been personally, I have to say, in a state of deep grief since November, because of course this is not just about a terrible, chaotic, bad man who, among other things, as just going back to that hijacking of Ukraine, he's not supporting Ukraine. Ukraine is losing at the moment. And Emad, I respect every word you said. And, I'm trained as a coach and I've done mediation, but you can't, if people don't want to negotiate, Putin has no intention of negotiating. Netanyahu has no real intention of negotiating. And Trump isn't interested in actual negotiation. He is interested in, having an idea and saying, do it. And if people don't instantly do it, he gets very bored. He's bored with Putin already. You could see it in the defeatism on his face after the phone call last night when he said, it was disappointing. I mean, disappointing is, a rather mild word to use of a country that has invaded another country. And he is refusing Ukraine the arms it needs to defend itself. You can't go into any kind of negotiations if you don't have the weapons to defend yourself through that process, let alone, extend the war. So it looks as if Ukraine is losing. And in terms of the big, beautiful bill and the democracy, I mean, I do think, I hope I'm wrong. I think you're right, John. I've agreed with every word you say, but what Trump has done at alarming speed very much echoes, and I know one is not meant to use this analogy because obviously it, unearths endless Pandora boxes, but I'm afraid there are heavy echoes with what happened in Germany during the 30s. There are many literal echoes of that. And although what happened yesterday was ostensibly done through the democratic processes, there was, not really. He's cowed. He's taken over the Republican Party to such a degree it has become a cult. And I don't know. And I think the other element in the whole of this is the tech bros. I'm not sure. Even if you had, Nelson Mandela as president of the US at the moment, I'm not sure that the mechanisms could really survive an election now, given the money and the social media element of it. I think it has been so infiltrated by Musk, Zuckerberg, all those guys who did not have a molecule of rectitude in their bodies and folded the minute Trump won and stood there at that inauguration supporting him, and then had instant makeovers where they're pumped up, God knows if they're all taking testosterone or what, but they instantly looked completely different. And that's the world we're in now. That's the world where muscular men who would be on some incel podcast if they weren't actually running enormous tech companies that are bigger than many nations, that's the world we're in now. And if I were in Iran, Russia, China, I would think, well, look at them. They call this democracy. They think this is superior to what we've got. Good luck with that. I think China is where the power is. And I think at this rate, it won't be long before China has not only annexed Taiwan, but clearly overcome the US in terms of influence. And in no way does China pretend to be a democracy. It isn't. And that is tragic for everybody, but particularly for the 30%-ish of us who have been lucky enough not to live in dictatorships, because it's all very well to be complacent and think, oh, well, Starmer's doing badly, fine. You try Farage and see how you feel then.
Yes, I mean, it's that absolutely true. And meanwhile, China is sort of sitting on the sidelines watching all of this happening and just rubbing their hands, I should imagine, because they're staying out of it and just enriching themselves in what's happening in the process everywhere else. And you see in America with let's defund Voice of America, let's cut off all the foreign aid. Why? Let's not send. We're not. Silly things like sending contraceptives to Africa. Let's stop all of that. We don't need to be doing that. Meanwhile, China is going around the world building airports and God knows what, creating infrastructure. And China is more and more becoming the country which does run the world, not America. America might feel they run the world, but actually, behind the scenes, China is really beginning to run the world. Discuss.
May I add something to what Christina said?
Sure. Go ahead, Sharon.
Thanks. I think first, I'm happy that you mentioned Germany in the 30s. The way that democracy ruined democracy, and we can see it similarly in other places in the world, including Israel and in the US. But as an activist, and that's what I am, I always think about what is our responsibility. So if the major casualty of the last attack on Iran, for example, is diplomacy, not the Iranian nuclear program, we still have other powers, including China, that are willing to do diplomacy in a more responsible way. And that includes Europe and the European Union and the other states that were, for example, in the P5+1, right? So apart from the US, there was Russia, the UK, France, China, and Germany that were in this deal with Iran that was working. So yeah, we can look at the US now and feel that democracy is dead and that's the end of the world. But in 1945, Europe didn't look that well after the Second World War. The UK didn't look that well after the Second World War. And now they have the European Union that you're not part of anymore, but and it's not perfect, but it was built. There's no reason to think that diplomacy doesn't have any more place and that democracies cannot repair themselves. During the first Trump administration, we could see, not just in the US, but mainly in the US, lots of protests, finally feminist organizations marching, human rights organization marching, and the minute that Biden got elected, it was all gone. And that was the responsibility that was not taken care of. I think maybe there's a lesson here that even our colleagues and activists from the US can take. But it is up to us to see and to look for all the diplomacy that is working and where it is that we can force it or make it stronger. And I'm sorry to sound so hippie, but to despair is not a plan of action. and we don't have the luxury to do so.
Yeah. May I just say, Sharon, I do agree with everything you've said. The thing I would say, in the post-war world, you didn't have Zuckerberg and Musk and, this whole ecosystem which has distorted communication, or the idea. You certainly had propaganda and censorship, but you didn't have the very concept of fake news and alternative reality in the way that we do have now, proliferating on a mass scale. I absolutely agree that despair, we can't actually despair. I'm just speaking personally about my own feelings about where we are at this point of history. And it's hard to summon hope. But of course, if we give up, then the battle is already lost. So I do agree with everything you've said.
Thank you. And for me, hope is a political decision. It's not that I wake up, open my phone, see the news, and my heart is rejoicing. Quite the opposite. And with this new media, we for too many decades, leftists were too pure. We're not doing this and we're not saying that. And maybe it's time for us to change the way we act. Look at what's working and stop purifying ourselves. For example, Trump's desire is to get a Nobel Peace Prize. One of the things that in Meto we tried, and people thought that we were laughing at the beginning or were really upset, was to go to some of our colleagues from organizations that won the Nobel Peace Prize and ask them to write a list of things that if Trump will do, they will nominate him. And we don't want to do that. He's an evil man and all that. This is not wanting to win. Nobody said that we have the power to give a Nobel Peace Prize, for example. But we do have the power to try and push Trump towards what we want him to do. Maybe he will, maybe he don't, but at least we can try.
Well, it's a strange concept that I wonder why Trump is so focused on getting a Nobel Peace Prize.
He's very vain, I think.
Triumph. Obama got him and he didn't.
A narcissistic sociopath.
He could try and win a Grammy or an Oscar or whatever. I mean, it's just the prize. I mean, it's what.
My point is that if we have a way to try and get what we think is needed, we should go for it.
Well, yes, Sharon, but that kind of contradicts what John. I mean, I sort of agree, and I think give the guy whatever he wants. If he wants a gold necklace, if he wants a Nobel Prize, if that will get us peace in Ukraine, whatever. And that's frankly what Starmer was doing when he invited him for a state visit. Of course, Starmer can't stand the man. I mean, he has to speak about the great chemistry they have. You have no choice if you're in that position because you have people whose lives depend on it. And of course, King Charles absolutely loathed him. But, the poor guy has to go through that absolute fiasco. And if you're in those positions, these are the things you have to do. But
you could have said allegedly there, Christina.
Okay.
You should say allegedly.
It leaks out of him, but allegedly, King Charles.
Okay, I mean, and yes, he's coming over.
But I just wanted to slightly, in response, in this context, I want to slightly disagree with what you said, John. You said people should refuse. Actually, you can only refuse if you have the power. And the president of South Africa isn't really in a position of power to walk out in a strop of a meeting with Trump. I mean, the horrible truth is nobody is really. And Mark Carney has we're too entangled. And Mark Carney has unique qualities that enable him to do that. And he's a tough guy. Most leaders are not able to do that. And I think everybody's walking around with a giant nose peg on their nose, thinking, "Please God, can we just get through the next few years?" Nobody is doing this willingly.
Meanwhile, as we're moving a little bit more towards Keir Starmer and so forth, we had scenes this week of the Chancellor of the Exchequer visibly sobbing, we should say, in the House of Commons. What was all that about? Why was Rachel Reeves crying in the House of Commons?
Well, I mean, obviously she was desperately upset. Apparently it was a personal matter, but you don't get much more personal than having completely, alas, messed up the running of a nation and having had a row with your boss and with the leader of the House, and then having to sit in front of the eyes of the nation. I mean, maybe there's a personal issue as well, and of course she should have just stayed home. I know what it's like to cry, not be able to control yourself. I've done it many times, and it's not great, but that's the way it goes. But luckily, I'm not Chancellor Exchequer, and I would, pretty much rather top myself than be Chancellor Exchequer. I think they're all under enormous pressure. They've done their best to patch it up yesterday, and the market showed that actually they had faith in Reeves' plan, and that, in fact, if anything, it has strengthened her position. So she will probably be feeling a little bit more cheerful now that she knows that Starmer can't get rid of her, or the markets will go absolutely wild.
Well, it was a weird thing that with all of the criticism of Rachel Reeves, especially in all of the right-wing newspapers, that at the end of the day, the fact that she was crying and might be leaving her role caused markets to start collapsing. So their view is that she isn't necessarily doing a terrible job, and somebody else coming in could make it worse. And I think that we can talk about the benefit system in the UK. And John, I'd like your views on that from your perspective. I mean, what we were trying to do here, or what the government was trying to do here, was to rein in some of this going forward. And if we can't do that, then the reality is then there will be more tax rises. And if there are more tax rises, it may negatively impact the economy. And I think, one hears figures like 25% of the people working in England are claiming disability benefits. And that's in addition to the 3 million people that aren't working because they're too disabled to work. So you've got 3 million people that are too disabled to work, and you've got a quarter of the working population that are working that are disabled and having to claim benefits as well. What is wrong with British society that we have got so many sick people? Or is it just that we've created a system that people are focused on milking the system rather than thinking they've got to go out to work? And I hate to sound like I'm not sympathetic towards people, but is the system broken, and can the system be fixed? Or are we just going to have to accept that it's part of British society, and all we're going to have to do is to keep increasing taxes to pay for it?
Well, firstly, on Reeves, we should acknowledge, I think, that she started her job with a really bad hand. Whether it was 20 or 22 billion pounds of a black hole, it was vastly different to what Gordon Brown started with in 1997 when he became Chancellor. The economy was growing then. They had, within a year or two, plenty of money to spend on the NHS, on eliminating waiting times and all kinds of other things. She hasn't had that. But what astonishes me, Chris, is the unwillingness, the complete unwillingness of a Labour government to countenance modest tax rises on those who could bear the burden of those rises most. So why not modest tax increases on people who earn more than £200,000 a year? A wealth tax, there have been lots of different analyses done that show it could a wealth tax, again, that would be relatively moderate in terms of its burden on people who have wealth of more than, say, £2 million, could raise between 10 and 20 billion pounds a year. So it's not like these options don't exist. The problem is politicians just don't want to do it. And you then, I think, have to ask questions really about where their priorities lie. And it's no coincidence, I think, that we are now seeing potentially the emergence of a new left-wing party. You might argue it's ridiculous because Corbyn is involved, but there are 5 or 6 other MPs who are also named. It's very early days. We don't know what will come of it, but I think in part it's because of these perceived terrible failures of the Labour government to govern in a Labour way over the last year or so. I think from the very beginning, Starmer and Reeves made it much more difficult for themselves by ludicrously accepting freebies, whether free concert tickets or soccer tickets or anything else, at a time when much of the population was struggling. That got them off on exactly the wrong foot, I think, with the electorate. The winter fuel decision was absolutely dreadful, but especially so from any Labour government. Now, I'm talking about all of this and not answering your question about sickness and ill health within the community. That, it seems to me, is something that places Britain as a kind of outlier in European terms. And I think it's something that is of such significance, it probably warrants a deep public inquiry. Why are so many people unfit and unable for work? In Ireland, we have full employment. The unemployment rate is about 4%. It's a completely different labour market than you seem to have in the United Kingdom. And I do sympathise then with Reeves and others who argued this can't go on. There has to be some kind of changing of the dial. But it reminds me that one of the big, long-standing failures in British politics goes back to the 1970s. It's about productivity. All politicians in opposition talk about ways in which they might increase productivity, and then they do absolutely nothing when they're in power. So there's a whole lot of very connected things here. But I think it's untrue to say that Labour has no options available to it. If it had courage, and I don't think Keir Starmer does, and I don't think his government does, if they did, I think they could tax income and they could tax wealth while leaving the vast majority of people alone. I can't see why that could not be done, and done quickly.
You know, people are willing to pay more taxes. I think we accept that we have to pay taxes for the whole country to operate. There are requirements that the government has to spend money. But do you think people think, you know what? I mean, I don't mind paying more taxes, but I don't think my taxes are being spent in the right way. And part of that is to reform the welfare system. Richard.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to come back on that a little bit. I mean, there is a very specific reason why Keir Starmer can't raise income taxes, which it was an explicit, election manifesto pledge not to raise income taxes. And I'd like to go back a bit. I think there's a connection with what Christina was saying a little while ago in a completely different context about social media, which is people call it the extreme nature of social media discourse, which it obviously often is. But I'd also like to say there's a sort of, it's really amplified utopian voices, I think. There is this, with with Johnson, it was called cakeism, this idea that, whatever people say on social media they would like to see is somehow possible and should be made possible. And I have no idea why Reeves was crying either, but when I was thinking, why would I cry if I was in her situation? I would say that, you've come to power with, in an incredibly difficult financial situation. We've had the financial crisis, which Britain particularly hasn't recovered from. And we've had the COVID crisis, which we took a very generous approach to, say, furlough and so on, but also causes amazing, fiscal issue, as well as all the other world problems of war in Ukraine and the Middle East and so on. And, everyone's thinking, why can't you just sort of, wave a magic wand and, everything will be fine. On the tax position, in many ways, I agree with what John says, but it's not an answer, right? I mean, the top 1% in Britain now pay 30% of all income tax, right? So there's only a certain amount you can say, let's screw the rich. And they have introduced a wealth tax with the non-dom tax change in a way. And that's, the current fiscal projections is that actually might lose money, because of non-doms leaving the country, or taking, hiding their wealth better in tax havens. We live in a world of tax havens. Ireland, is a great comparison to Britain in some ways, but it's a tax haven. The reason the Irish economy is doing so well is because it's a tax haven, and Google and Apple channel all their profits through Ireland, which gives it an artificially inflated GDP and creates jobs and all the rest of it, but is depriving America of its taxes, because those taxes really, as American companies, should be being paid in America or in the countries where the profits are being generated. So we all say that these problems are easy. I mean, I'd go back to actually on the income tax thing to Gordon Brown, actually, who I kind of think is the worst Chancellor of the Exchequer in my adult life, even though everyone admires him so much. He was the person who who out-Thatchered Thatcher by reducing the basic rate of income tax to 20%, which is a ludicrously low rate of income tax, in an environment where it is electoral suicide, so you're going to pick up income taxes. And ever since then, because we can't raise this basic, incredibly low rate of basic tax, you have to tax everything else. And so you actually, when it comes to productivity and everything, you have to tax everything that governments want people to do to generate economic growth. So you have to tax jobs, you tax, national insurance, which is a tax on jobs, employers' national insurance, which is a tax on providing people jobs. You have to you have to raise stamp duty, which is a tax on social mobility and economic mobility. You have to tax corporate profits, which is a tax on investment, and it's a tax on, expanding your company. You tax death duties, which I agree with in principle, but it's also a tax on dying. You reduce child benefits, which is a tax on being born. So everything we want people to do and everything people do is being taxed to make up for this fact that Gordon Brown, reduced our income tax level to an incredibly low level, which now can't be raised again. I think that is, to me, that, and because everyone thought that was great at the time, and we all loved Gordon Brown because he was finally, we had a sort of socially conscientious, centre-left, progressive chancellor. We've totally forgotten how these apparently good decisions, these apparently, things we can all get behind, can have these terrible consequences further down the line. And I think we have to be really careful about that.
I'll just come back, if I can, briefly, sorry, and I will say that's all fine, very well, but 50% of the population basically hasn't had a pay rise since the 1980s. And they are furious at us, the elites. They hate us with a passion. They don't distinguish between us at all. Meanwhile, the plutocracy is wealthier than ever before. People see that, they understand it, and this is why they're turning to charlatans like Farage. They're doing it in nearly every European jurisdiction as well, because the dynamics are the same. So at some point, governments are going to have to reckon with this, deal with it, and tax wealth effectively. Otherwise, we are all looking at what happened in Russia in 1917. I can guarantee
the problem is you try and fund your fiscal deficits, your government, by taxing the wealthy. This is exactly what Gordon Brown did by this. It's the other side of that coin. If you're going to fund everything by taxing the wealthy, you have to encourage plutocracy. You have to have rich people in order to tax them to fund your welfare system. So this is exactly what Gordon Brown did. So he targeted middle incomes. Right, so he all his targets, like child poverty, for example, which is which was one of his most important targets, to raise children out of child poverty. Fine, great. Everyone said absolutely wonderful. What's the measure of child poverty? It's children living in households earning less than 60% of the median household income. What's the easiest way to get that figure up? It is by stabilizing median household incomes, which Gordon Brown did with a whole range of pay freezes and restrictions on local government spending and NHS spending and on government salaries, which are the benchmark for middle income median salaries. So he targeted that. That stopped pay rises in jobs like all the things we care about, like nursing, dustmen, which creates the same thing in sort of low to medium paid factory work, all the rest of it. And he said it doesn't matter because we're going to have taxes on the rich. And that's when this massive increase in the tax rate on the super rich came in. And what did Peter Manuel say? We don't care how rich the rich get because we're going to tax them. We care about ordinary people, and we want to keep taxes low on ordinary people. So they kept taxes low on ordinary people, but they did it by keeping salaries low on ordinary people. And that's where we are now. We're now in this progressive situation where, in order to fund our welfare system, the NHS, all the rest of it, we have to have more and more super rich people who we can then tax. And that is what's totally destabilized our fiscal system in Britain, particularly.
That's very interesting, Richard, what you had to say. I mean, I think we all need to take that on board a little bit if we haven't thought about it before. But in the mess that we're in, let's say we're in a mess, is Farage the answer? And if Farage is not the answer, how do we stop him being put up as being the answer?
If he is the answer, I will send you passport applications. You're all very welcome to come to Dublin.
I wish, John, I would have taken one ages ago, but alas, I'm half Swedish, was born in Italy, and I'm not eligible to live anywhere except the wretched United Kingdom. So it's very annoying, and everyone I know seems to have some distant Irish relative who's enabling them to have an EU passport. May I just briefly respond to the welfare reform thing, Chris? Because you mentioned. Why are we so sick? And we don't actually really have the answers to that. But I do think that people have been, for some of the reasons that have been touched on, and also because there are areas of the country that are kind of deserts, really, have been incentivized to claim disability benefits. And 12 years ago, I spent a long time investigating a big piece of the Sunday Times Magazine about intergenerational unemployment. And I went to a Welsh, I can't remember the name of the village now, but a place in the Welsh valleys. And, there are places like Merthyr Tydfil. There are places in the UK where almost entire communities are on benefits. And these people the people I met were all, nobody had worked for, literally generations. There was work in the area, but it was all being done by EU immigrants, and they were all registered as each other's carers, and there was nothing visibly wrong with any of them. They seemed to have, this sounds awful, but they seemed to have a perfectly okay life. They could perhaps have worked as care workers or in shops or whatever, but they didn't. I'm not blaming any of the individuals concerned, because everybody responds to the system they are in and uses the mechanisms available to give themselves what they perceive to be the best life possible. But I do think I applaud Labour's desire to reform welfare, because it is not sustainable, and it is currently parking a quarter of young people on what might be an entire life without work and on benefits, which is a tragedy. And I think many of those young people have their disability is what they would regard as mental ill health. Now, are we pathologizing normal stress? Those poor, everybody went through enormous stress in COVID, and just daily exposure to social media is plenty of stress for everyone, let alone what's happening in the world. But, we have to, this is long-term, deep work. It's a bit like what Gordon Brown did do in terms of child poverty and Sure Start and those things. You have to tackle it systemically. Cutting benefits is a very crude weapon. I think sometimes it is necessary. I don't think the actual bill would have worked. But I think in terms of your most recent question, Chris, yes. I think what Labour can only carry on trying to do some of the stuff they're doing. I support their plans for the NHS broadly. I think where Starmer is mistaken is he does think it's all about delivery. And although delivery does matter, communication matters enormously. And this is where Farage is a million miles ahead of everyone else. And in fact, watching Wes Streeting on Newsnight last night, Wes Streeting is a million miles ahead of pretty much everybody else in Labour. And I'm not saying let's get rid of Starmer and have Streeting, and now I've no idea what he would be like as Prime Minister, but I do know that you need someone who can really communicate and hit people in the gut, and we do not have that with Starmer.
Quite, we do not have that with Starmer, and we do not, we may or may not like Kemi Badenoch, but I don't think anyone really thinks that Kemi Badenoch is the answer. Including probably 99% of the Conservative Party and Conservative voters as well right now. And the Farage support, just on the issue of the welfare system, I imagine that most of Farage's support would be in favour of the welfare system, and they're the same people that are supporting him because he's going to be tough on illegal immigrants, and God knows how we solve the illegal immigrant problem, but that's another story. But at least he's coming over as someone that says he can fix everything, and nobody else appears to be able to fix anything, and that's why he is so clearly ahead in the polls and the bookies' favourite. So my question is there any way to stop him?
I think that we have to get beyond social media. We have to think clearly about what he's doing and what he's saying. Somehow, I don't know how, get that into public consciousness. This thing occurred to me because of my writing about China and trade and the whole trade issue, which is a different issue. There's something really extraordinary has just happened in Britain with its relation to America, and Farage is in the middle of it, and no one has noticed, right? So What did Trump do recently? He put on his massive Liberation Day tariffs on everybody. What did that specifically target? There were extra tariffs on the steel industry and the car industry, including in Britain. And, that trade deal did, take away some of the damage. Where do we export most of our cars to? That famous Nissan factory at Sunderland, where's its biggest export market? It's America. What happened last month after those tariffs? Motor production collapsed. Completely collapsed because we couldn't sell to America because it put in these massive tariffs. Even though the tariffs have been reduced, there are still tariffs there, which will affect British car and steel exports to America, which is a major, major market for those industries. So, and who supported Trump? Who said, who was the one British politician that went over there and said, vote for Trump, he's my sort of guy. He's the guy who is destroying the British car and steel industry, which is supposed to be the old industrial, heartland industry in the north of England and the provinces that the Reform voters all say they're going to vote for. So why is nobody pointing out that Farage has actually, voted, well, not technically voted, but sort of, supporting the policies in America that are destroying British heartland manufacturing industry? Why is no one pointing that out? I think that's the sort of thing that we have to look for, look to try and point out with Farage. He's a fantasist, right? Suddenly he's describing himself as a left-wing party. He's outflanking Starmer on the left. I mean, we have to find ways of countering these completely ridiculous narratives. We know that isn't what it would be like if Farage was in power.
I mean, he is the left-wing party, and that's why Labour are running scared of him. But meanwhile, where is the centre-right party? Should it not be the centre-right party that are coming up with all of these questions to Farage? He's getting away with everything because there is no one holding him to account on anything. Why? Who should be holding him to account? Where's Kemi Badenoch's role in this?
Well, ultimately, the thing that may hold him to account is the British electoral system, because it is one that is so blunt. I have no doubt that the opinion polls are right that reform is polling somewhere between 25 and 30%. But what will that translate to on the day of a general election? It's almost impossible for parties to come from nowhere and win a majority. On current numbers, he's going to have at least the kind of majority that Starmer had last year. But that seems extremely unlikely, I think, to psephologists who have studied elections over a very long period of time.
I think psephologists are looking at this, John, and they are looking at, they're digging deeper into everything, and they are actually seeing that although you would think that you would be right, that you are not necessarily right, and that with him on 30 to 35%, that could translate even into a reform majority as big as the Labour majority currently.
May I say, I think there is a real possibility. I mean, it's an outlying possibility that Farage will be the next Prime Minister. I think they've also got, the possibility of reform blowing themselves up in some way over the next few years is also pretty high. But if Farage did become Prime Minister, obviously it would be a tragic moment in British history. But once people have tasted populism, they might be slightly less keen to vote for it another time. And maybe in the end, that's what we'll need. I don't think Farage really wants to be PM. He wants the name like Johnson, but he doesn't really want to do the work. He will find the compromises of power, or would find the compromises of power an absolute nightmare. And I think that a taste of what an NHS under Farage, of what the small boat situation under Farage, what international diplomacy looks like, would cause people to think it would be an awful way to get there. But I think populism, unless you dismantle democracy in the way that Trump is trying to do, and I don't think Farage would do that, then ultimately we might emerge stronger.
But it's going to be a long haul, and we're probably going to need different people around to compensate for it on the other side. Okay, well, have we nailed it? I have absolutely no idea. We've certainly overrun. We've had a great conversation. I've missed doing this. It's good to be back. Good to see everybody again. You've been listening to Right on the Nail again for the first time for quite some time with me, Chris Wright. Thank you to Christina Patterson, John O'Brennan, Sharon and Richard, and also to Emad for joining us briefly as well. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with your friends and family, and make sure to hit the follow button on your podcast app. The podcast is produced by Tom Platz at soundsapien.com. And as I said, we're going to hopefully be back every month with an episode. Whether it'll be quite as exhilarating as this one, I'm not sure. Let's hope it is. And thank you all very much for listening. I've hit the nail.